True crime. Is it true? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Hello, hi, welcome or welcome back to Mia Likes Movies. My name is Mia and I like movies. I like a lot of other things too, but Mia Likes Movies just sounded the best. Today we are talking about true crime. Specifically, we are talking about what happens when we dramatize true crime and how perspectives, narratives, and genres can affect how those stories are perceived. I was inspired to make this video after watching Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story on Netflix and seeing the discussions happening online regarding the ethics of the series. Ryan Murphy, one of the co-creators of the series, has received a lot of valid criticism and backlash regarding the show. Even Eric Menendez, one of the subjects of the series, criticized Murphy and the show, allegedly saying, quote, "It is with a heavy heart that I say I believe Ryan Murphy cannot be this naive and inaccurate about the facts of our lives so as to do this without bad intent. But who has the right to tell these stories, and do these stories need to be told? If so, is a narrative-focused docuseries the best genre to do so?" And just a reminder, I am just a person on the internet compiling research and information and regurgitating it back to you with some attempt of nuance. I don't even have a degree in journalism. I have a degree. That's not it, but that's where I went. But my degree's in theater. Take everything I say with a grain of salt, I guess. I'm trying to inject some nuance back into our current climate of content and media. I can attempt to answer these questions that I'm posing, but the conclusions I come to may not and are probably not the same ones you come to, but let's have that discussion together. That's why we're here. Many people have talked about the issues with the true crime genre, but I feel we do not always touch on what happens when we dramatize it. Can crafting a narrative from true crime stories seemingly for entertainment ever be ethical? First, I want to talk about the true crime genre, its origins, and its distinctions. The modern era of true crime was ushered in by the true detective magazines of the early 20th century. These magazines were first published in the early 1920s. Originally titled True Detective Mysteries, these magazines would initially publish mystery fiction pieces with some nonfiction crime stories sprinkled throughout. However, after seeing the popularity of these nonfiction stories with their readers, the publishers would then pivot their focus to sharing more true crime, changing the name to simply True Detective. From the 1940s to 1960s, True Detective was at the height of its popularity and sold millions of copies. The true crime genre would then grow after the 1960s, specifically in America. Now, according to a 2024 survey by YouGov, over half of Americans say that they consume true crime content. If you look at the list of most popular podcasts on Spotify, you will see a variety of true crime podcasts, including Rotten Mango coming in at number 6 at the time of writing this, and Crime Junkie at number 9. Not to mention events like CrimeCon, which, yes, is a convention for true crime fans, amassed thousands upon thousands of attendees each iteration. This event has even gotten so popular that they have extended to cruises, with Crime Cruise setting sail in Miami, Florida. I believe it already has set sail, actually, by the time of writing this. Hope they had fun. I don't think I could go on a cruise. They scare me. So yes, true crime is popular, and it actually had humble beginnings as a magazine in the 1920s. But what exactly is true crime? At its most basic essence, according to Don K. Cecil in Fear, Justice, and Modern True crime is the nonfiction narrative of criminal events. I like this definition personally because it acknowledges the difference between true crime and investigative journalism, which is narrative. Let's break this very simple definition down. This may be a little bit of overkill, I'm aware of that, but I fear it might be necessary for some of my viewers. Let's start with nonfiction. True crime is based in our reality, telling true stories based on facts. Nonfiction. Next word, narrative. Unlike a lengthy court document or recording of an interview, the genre is based in narrative, telling a story. Ultimately, those who create true crime content are attempting to tell an overarching story. Pair this with the previous word and we get nonfiction narrative. Again, simple. A story based on true events. However, I would like to add a sort of caveat to this. Nonfiction narratives are often the sequencing and arranging of facts and events from real life to craft a story. A recording of an interview can tell a story, but at its core, the purpose of an interview is not to tell a story. It is to obtain information from the person being interviewed. A writer can then take an interview and craft a story, or dare I say narrative, from the information obtained to share with their audience. Journalists do this all the time. All of this to say that true crime is true in the sense that it is nonfiction, but at the end of the day, the purpose of the genre is to tell a story, to entertain, not necessarily to inform. And this is why I actually prefer Jean Murley's definition in her book, The Rise of True Crime, 20th Century Murder in American Pop Culture. Murley often refers to true crime as a murder narrative. In her book, she defines the genre as so. A murder narrative is a story. The story of real events shaped by the teller and imbued with his or her values and beliefs about such events. It's a much more specific definition and takes into account that the teller or narrator of the events affects the story being told. Many people like to call true crime infotainment. A fun way to say what we've been saying this whole time. There are facts, research, and information, but they are strung together to entertain, not necessarily to inform. Don K. Cecil's aforementioned book, Fear, Justice, and Modern True Crime, depicts a continuum of media representations of crime. This continuum showcases a general evolution of how crime can turn into entertainment. I like this diagram because it differentiates true crime, the genre, from crime drama inspired by a real crime. Because in my opinion, they are two different things. As you can kind of gather in this continuum, the further we sort of get away from the original crime, the more fictitious the representation becomes. Dramatizations of crimes are not true crime. They are two different things. The difference being how the story is told through perspective, narrative, and genre, all of which come together to create verisimilitude within the narrative. As we saw in the lovely continuum of media representations of crime, crime drama inspired by a real crime is closer to fiction than it is to the crime itself, which represents reality or fact. But how is it more fictitious than true crime? The answer is drama. To dramatize something is to act something out. Think theater or drama. When a writer adapts or dramatizes a real-life event, they must take several things into account in order to create a successful script. A script that tells a cohesive story and gets the writer's message or purpose across. In order to do so, the writer must have a perspective on the sequence of events, form a narrative through connecting the events and filling plot holes, and choosing the genre in which to present their story. All of these features work together to add to the overall verisimilitude of their piece. You may have remembered learning about perspective or point of view in your English classes in school. Writers will choose a point of view when telling their story, the most common being either a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective. Choosing the point of view for the story is a vital choice for a writer, as it becomes a vehicle in which they tell their story. A first-person point of view is often the easiest way to express opinions, as the actions are happening either directly to the narrator, or they are reacting to actions happening directly around them. A lot of the times, first-person stories can contain bias or unreliable narrators, as they, the narrator, use their opinions to tell the story. It's happening from their perspective. For example, The Hunger Games is written from the first-person perspective. Katniss is not necessarily an unreliable narrator, but she is a biased one. She tells the story of her journey in the 74th Annual Hunger Games from her perspective, imbuing the narrative with her opinions as a teenage girl from District 12. If the story was told by any other character, any other narrator, like Peeta for example, The Hunger Games would be a very different book and a very different story. A third-person perspective is told by someone or something removed from the actions of the plot. The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak is told by an omniscient narrator called Death. The Book Thief follows a young girl named Liesel during Nazi Germany. Zusak uses Death as the narrator in order to explore the indomitability of the human spirit and the continuing presence of death, lowercase d, in our world. By choosing a third-person perspective, a writer gives himself more freedom to explore different characters' journeys or tell the story with less bias from the characters the events are happening to. With true crime dramatizations, perspective is key, as it will affect how the audience interprets the characters and their roles in the story, along with the plot. Will the story be told from a first-person perspective? If so, do we tell the story from the perspective of the killer, the victim, or even the investigators? Or will the story be told from a third-person perspective, with an attempt to be unbiased in the narrative? All options have some validity depending on what the writer is trying trying to say? Do you want to create more sympathy for the killer to explore how one is driven to kill? A first-person perspective will work perfectly. Is everyone seemingly in the wrong and you want to show how nothing is black and white? Maybe try a third-person perspective. Regardless, choosing a point of view when dramatizing true crime stories will inform how the audience reacts to and relates to the events and characters within the narrative. Now, when crafting a narrative, especially based on a pre-existing event or story, one must decide what stays in the story and what gets cut. With true crime specifically, we do not always get the whole story. Witnesses can even have differing accounts on the same event. The perpetrator might tell a completely different story than the victim. The writer has to decide which accounts fit in their narrative, and in doing so, they, in a way, sort of add a validity to them. They are choosing to give those narratives a platform, a vehicle to be told. We will talk about this more later when we talk about Ryan Murphy, so just keep this idea of crafting a narrative in mind as we go on. Additionally, how is the narrative being structured? Is it being done linearly? Or is the story being told non-linearly? Or even through flashbacks? All of these choices, again, affect the audience's interpretation of the story. Genre informs how the story is told. Comedy, drama, mystery, etc. For true crime adaptations, more often than not, we are seeing dramas and mysteries as they fit well with the subject matter. That being said, sometimes we do get a dark comedy. A good example of this is actually 2017's I, Tonya, which is legitimately a true crime dramatization. You know, objectively, the events surrounding the 1994 assault on Nancy Kerrigan are not funny, but this film uses the genre of the dark comedy with varying first-person perspectives to sort of showcase the absurdity of Tonya Harding, her family, and her associates. And I keep saying this, but it is true. Genre is the vehicle for the story, and it will control how the audience interprets and interacts with the events of the story. It's the lens in which the audience will view the events. So yes, you can choose any genre to tell your story, but doing a dark comedy, say, will allow the audience to laugh and make light of certain things, whereas a drama will force the audience to take things seriously. So you have to be careful when choosing your genre because it will affect how they perceive the actual case. So I have used this word several times already, and you may not be super familiar with it. Verisimilitude. Now, I learned about verisimilitude in my high school theater history class as it related to Greek theater, just for context. So what is verisimilitude? Verisimilitude, at least how we will be discussing it, refers to the believability of the world within a work of fiction. In musical theater, for example, the verisimilitude of the world of those pieces calls for and accepts the fact that people will be bursting into song. Other characters don't freak out when the main character starts singing because it's normal for them. Perspective, narrative structure, and genre will all work together to create the overall verisimilitude for a piece of fiction. It's important to note that the verisimilitude that creates the world within a piece of fiction does not translate to the real world. Even if it is dealing with real events, the world that is created within a piece of fiction does not equate to that in real life. But this is the problem with true crime dramatizations. Because they are based on real events and actual people, people viewing them will mistake the truth within the fictional narrative for that in our real world, which is not always true. What they forget is that dramatizations are just that. Dramatizations. Their purpose is to entertain, not to inform. Which brings us to Mr. Ryan Murphy. Now, this next section of the video is a little bit more informal because it will be focusing mostly on my opinions about the Monster series on Netflix. Just putting that out there. So Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story is what originally inspired this video because I was fascinated not only with the series itself, but with the controversy surrounding it. Now, Ryan Murphy is not a stranger to controversy. After all, this is the man that gave us Glee.
25% show tunes, 25% hip-hop, 25% classic rock.
100% gay.
Now here's my hot take. I think Ryan Murphy has done a lot of good for TV. And I do mean that. Shows like Glee, Pose, The Normal Heart, all of which are shows that he either acted as executive producer and or showrunner on, brought diverse and queer stories to the forefront of mainstream media. Many of these series gained critical acclaim and success and awards. And you have to give credit where credit is due. But Monsters is different. Now, the first season of Monsters was actually Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, starring Niecy Nash and Evan Peters. Evan Peters said that during filming, Ryan Murphy's major rule was that the story was not going to be told from Dahmer's perspective. However, as a viewer, I have to say I did not get that at all. I felt that too much of the series was told from Dahmer's perspective. The first several episodes pretty much just follow Dahmer as a child, which builds sympathy for him as we see him struggle to navigate the world around him. And I understand that by starting at the end, by introducing us to him getting arrested and then flashing back, we are supposed to be remembered that the child we are seeing does become a monster. But there is so much focus on his childhood that you kind of forget where we started with the series. We get splashes of the present here and there, but the large amount of flashbacks of a young, outcast Dahmer remind us that we should feel bad for him. Later on in the season, we do get more episodes from other perspectives, like episode 6 that focuses on Tony Hughes' story, played by Ronnie Burford, which is a really powerful and moving episode that focuses on one of Dahmer's victims. Or the pocket of scenes that we get where we focus on Glenda Cleveland's perspective, Dahmer's neighbor, played by Niecy Nash, who, I found out during researching this, was not actually Dahmer's next door neighbor. Rather, she lived across the street from him. But in this adaptation, I guess they thought it would be more interesting to the overall narrative if Glenda was his next door neighbor. Although, like I said, we do get moments of other perspectives, the majority of this first season focuses on Dahmer, which makes sense, it is about him. But Murphy's thesis for this series is, are monsters made or are they born? So, by showing Dahmer's past, Murphy wants us to reflect on whether Dahmer was born a monster or became one due to his circumstances. And I do think this is a valid question to ask. However, if we focus too much on his past, if we create too much sympathy, we lessen the impact of his horrible crimes. Matthew K. Silk wrote in Dahmer and the Dramatization of Crime, quote, "The series has been criticized for its slow, matter-of-fact pacing, giving the audience a voyeuristic perspective on Dahmer's activities without analysis. And this was my biggest issue with the first season. There is too much focus on Dahmer. Again, I get it. It is about him. However, I do think it romanticized him in a way rather than debated his status as monster. There's just simply not enough focus on the other perspectives in the narrative for it to truly talk about him as a full person. Like, yes, we do get a whole episode dedicated to Tony Hughes and we get glimpses of other perspectives throughout the season, but it's just simply not enough, okay? Dahmer murdered 17 people. 17! And those are just the ones that we know about, right? One episode dedicated to one victim and a couple of scenes here and there that show other victims is just not enough. He is a monster, and frankly, I don't care if he was bullied as a child. He murdered 17 people. I don't need to feel bad for him. I don't care. I would much rather have a series that gives a platform to his victims and their families with their consent, okay? Which, by the way, Murphy didn't get. Rita Isbell, who is the sister of one of Dahmer's victims, Errol Lindsay, told Insider that she was never consulted about the show. Perry also said, "If you're actually curious about the victims, my family are pissed about this show. It's re-traumatizing over and over again. And for what? How many movies/shows/documentaries do we need?" Dramatizing Dahmer's life gives him a platform more so than it does for his victims. In my opinion, Glenda Cleveland's perspective was infinitely more interesting than Dahmer's. I would have watched a whole season of just her story. And like I said before, Glenda Cleveland wasn't even actually Dahmer's next door neighbor. That was another woman, Pamela Bass. And I know why they combined the characters from an outside perspective. It streamlines the narrative, and I'm guessing they just found Glenda Cleveland's overall story more compelling in comparison to Pamela Bass's. But this is also part of the problem. If you really wanted to explore the story from all perspectives, why would you get rid of a whole perspective? Or rather, combine it with a completely different one? It just doesn't make sense for the purpose of the show. Now, what makes the second season unique is that the perpetrators, Lyle and Eric Menendez, are still very much alive. And Eric had a lot to say regarding the dramatization of their lives. Eric criticized the show, saying, "Murphy shapes his horrible narrative through vile and appalling character portrayals of Lyle and of me and disheartening slander." Amongst other things, Murphy responded to this criticism by saying, "How do you assassinate the character of two people who killed their own parents?" Which I have to say is a fair point, and he did kind of eat with that. Regarding the second season, Murphy said that they took the Rashomon approach, saying, quote, "It talks about countless perspectives, and a perspective is not a lie," end quote, which I have to disagree with. People lie all the time, especially when recounting things from their own perspective, especially if it makes them look better or even more like a victim. So respectfully, Ryan Murphy, that just doesn't make any sense. Also, which we've already touched on, by giving these perspectives a platform, You can romanticize them and or give them validity. So what's up with that? For example, in the second season, a major point of view character is Dominic Dunn, played by Nathan Lane. Dominic Dunn was an investigative journalist that was highly critical of the Menendez brothers throughout their trial. In real life and in the show, he theorized that the brothers were actually in an incestual relationship with one another, which is a disgusting and vile accusation to make. But Murphy dramatizes this in the show. Not just a quick mention through dialogue. No, we get it, albeit a very short, scene of the brothers being romantic with one another in the shower. Narratively, is it interesting? I mean, sure, I guess, but wow, these are real people. You are accusing real people of being in an incestual relationship. Like, yes, they killed their parents, but they were also allegedly abused by their parents, all of which was also dramatized in the show. I mean, it just feels like really gross all around, and I didn't need to see that, so thanks. Much like Dahmer, the beginning of this season also focuses on Eric and Lyle Menendez. And here's the thing, I don't think they portrayed them in a super sympathetic light. Not until later in the series. The first couple of episodes really do portray them as rich, entitled assholes, yelling at children, doing cocaine, and spending their dead parents' money without much remorse.
That is illegal. I'm an American citizen, and an American citizen has certain rights. It's in the Constitution!
It isn't until later, when the sexual abuse allegations are brought up, that we get some sympathy for the brothers. However, the way the show portrays it, it seems like the abuse allegations were just a ploy by their lawyers to get them off the hook easier, because they don't bring it up until the lawyers show up and they're already in jail. It's not like something that we see early on in the show prior to when the trial is starting to begin. And this was a very real opinion that people had during the time, by the way. I talked to my parents about the case because they were both in their 20s when the case happened. Even they might have thought it back then too. Because the show only brought it up and dramatized it in relation to their court case, it makes it seem like it only had to do with their case and not something that actually happened to them, which is an issue. It is not actually telling the story from Eric or Lyle's perspective, just an outside perspective. The structure of the narrative doesn't relate the abuse to them as people, but rather to them as criminals. Unlike Dahmer, who was very clearly the monster regardless of his childhood, Eric and Lyle were victims, allegedly. This is where all of those things we talked about earlier come into play about crafting a narrative and verisimilitude. Murphy wanted to utilize many different perspectives in this series, allowing them all to affect the narrative. However, in doing so, they all become valid in the world of the show. The verisimilitude of the series calls for us, the audience, to believe all the narratives we see because, apparently, according to Murphy, all perspectives are valid. So debating whether or not these brothers were victims of sexual abuse, which was proven in court at one point, whether or not they were in an incestual relationship, which both Eric and Lyle have denied, is all valid to the narrative, apparently. And this is the problem with the series. When you give all perspectives a platform, you give them equal plausibility, regardless of their actual relevance or authenticity. So let's return to the questions I asked in the intro of this video. Who has the right to tell these stories? Do these stories need to be told? If so, is a narrative-focused docuseries the best genre to do so? And can crafting a narrative from true crime stories seemingly for entertainment ever be ethical? Did I count that correctly? Who has the right to tell these stories? Anyone but Ryan Murphy, I guess. I'm joking, obviously. That being said, I think anyone has the right to tell these stories. At least in America. Free speech, am I right? So, yes, I guess technically anyone has the right to tell these stories, but when we do so without including the victims and their families, we get into dangerous territory. Is it fair to tell these stories without their consent? I mean, they didn't consent to being a part of a true crime story in the first place. And that's the issue. It can become exploitative very quickly. Do these stories need to be told? Yes, I think so. I actually like true crime. I listen to several true crime podcasts. I mean, for me personally, I like listening to it for the psychological analysis. And I think also it's about recognizing red flags in a sort of way. I mean, as a woman, navigating the world can be extremely dangerous, and true crime can often show us what things to avoid. And I think there is some validity in that. Also, I think it's important to highlight the victims and their stories. Those are the stories that need to be told, to remember and celebrate them. We shouldn't just erase them from the narrative to punish their perpetrator. That's not fair to them. Is a narrative-focused docuseries the best genre to tell these stories? Personally, no. I don't think so. While many of these series can bring us some amazing performances, like Niecy Nash in Dahmer or Cooper Koch in the Menendez brothers, I just don't think these series as a whole tell these stories in a way that is helpful to anyone. Yes, they do bring the stories some relevancy, but that is mostly due to Ryan Murphy's power as a producer and not necessarily the series themselves. Murphy could have easily chosen to produce genuine documentaries exploring these cases, but he didn't. He chose to dramatize them. He chose to craft narratives using various perspectives regardless of their truthfulness. That is what he chose to do. And these dramatizations can often do more harm than good. Not to mention, they erase the actual faces of the victims and perpetrators as the audience watches the actors portray them. Thus, in a way relating to the actors' portrayals and not the real beings that were actually affected by the events in real life, which in my opinion can also be a problem. Finally, can crafting a narrative from true crime stories seemingly for entertainment ever be ethical? No, hot take, but I don't think we should derive entertainment from the exploitation of victims. Am I a little hypocritical in saying this, as I just admitted to enjoying some true crime podcasts? Yes, I am aware. I am part of the problem. I can still say it is unethical to consume this kind of content while consuming this kind of content. In fact, that might even make it more valid because I've actually consumed the content. Right? Right. But like I said, I don't think we should be deriving entertainment from the exploitation of victims. Point blank, period. But what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I want to hear your answers to these questions in the comments below. So the poll for this month's video was, are true crime shows / movies that are based on and dramatize real stories ethical? We had about 32 votes. 58% of people said no, 29% said it depends, and 13% said yes. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I know this is now not as relevant as it was before, but I started this script back in November. Things happened, and now I finally finished it. But you know, time gives us perspective. I think there's still validity in posting this, so I'm gonna do it. So the Oscar nominations just came out. If you'd like me to do a video on my predictions, let me know. I did that last year. Also, if you would like me to watch every single Best Picture nomination, let me know. I will do it. I will do it. I don't think I will enjoy it considering some of the things that were nominated. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I think that's it. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.